My first question is, your last novel was in 1995, and since then you've been writing what readers and critics sometimes call autofiction, whether that's true or not. Maybe you don't see it that way at all. Works that in some cases are hard to classify. Are they memoirs, biographies, histories, a little of all those things? And even Limonov has a bit of a novelist style, even though it's a documentation of a man's life, yet written in the first person, I believe. Do you consider yourself a novelist or a non-fiction writer? Is the I in your book you?
In fact, I don't care very much about genre, about that. Well, I did write novels for quite, well, more than 10 years. And now what I write, well, it's considered not, and well, it's not fiction, that's true. So you can call that non-fiction, but I try to write it, they are written also like novels. The difference being that the characters and the events they don't came out of my imagination. They are not fiction. But I craft the thing like a novel, and I hope it gives the pleasure and the excitement that one is expecting from a novel, the kind of suspense, pleasure of reading, things like that. But yeah, from the first book of that kind that I wrote, which was The Adversary, about now 15 years ago, I avoid, putting a subtitle on the cover of the book. I don't write a novel, I don't write anything as biography. Maybe I should write a book, but it would be a bit redundant. But there are books.
Was describe this evolution you had when you were first writing what we call straight-up novels? Is it something that you just felt like you needed to tell a story that was true, or were you exhausted by the idea of creating fiction, or did you just find yourself suddenly writing stories about real people?
Well, there was no there is no rejection of fiction, of the novel. I am a novel reader. I love novels, and there is nothing ideological, nothing like the idea that the novel is something that is dead, that is old-fashioned. No. I'm a devoted lover of novels. But in fact, what happened for me was that I began in the early 90s. I began to work on a true crime story, which was called the Roman case. This Roman was a man who killed all his family, and which unfortunately happens is not that uncommon. But what was more uncommon is that one discovered that after these crimes, that he had been lying to everybody, his family and everybody around him, for almost 20 years, pretending to be a doctor, to be a civil servant in the comment dire health. Okay, and he was not. And well, that was a terrible story, also very challenging one to write about. And it took me about 7. I began to work on that after the thing happened, which is in 1993. The book was published in 2000, which means that it was almost 7 years that spent not only on that, but with that in the landscape. And it was, I don't want to be emphatic, but it was some kind of psychological ordeal to do that, because of the horror of the story, and also of the very demanding and complicated relation with the man with this murderer who was and is still alive, with whom I visited in jail, whose trial I attended, and I tried to write it like fiction. I tried to write it like the kind of novel. For every writer who attempts to write a true crime story can't avoid to have in his mind In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which was a model for me too. But I in fact, I didn't succeed in writing something like in Cold Blood, and there was a moment where I discovered that first it was out of question to make fiction, a work of fiction, that I had to write that kind of non-fictional but account of true things, true facts, and if you are supposed to, and if things are supposed to be true, they have to be. Well, you know, you have some even some kind of legal responsibility. You know, people can sue you if you say things that are that's. And also, I discovered I did in fact two steps in the same time. One was from fiction to non-fiction, and the other one was from the third person to the first one. And it's, in fact, these two things were very closely linked for me, and very deeply, because, you know, when you, and it's quite simple, when you write fiction, you can't say, Madame Bovary or Julien Sorel or any fictional character, he thinks so and so. Well, there are characters who come from the mind of the author. He knows everything about them. Their history, his creature. But if you want to do so, if you want to say something like that about a character like this Jean-Claude Roman, this murderer, who is a very mysterious character. You don't know where his motivations. He's quite opaque. He is, and he's a black box to whom his mind is a black box to which you have no access. So saying Jean-Claude Roman thinks something so and so, it's very on both an artistic and a moral and a philosophic level. It's very it's complicated. And well, I couldn't do that. So I discovered that the only possible position was to say, well, I think, in front of him, I guess, I imagine that's what he has in his mind. I discovered, you know, that when you are writing non-fiction, you can't pretend that you are telling the truth. You can pretend that at best, you are telling your truth. You are telling that, and it may be a very narrow truth. But you have to be aware of that and to let your reader be aware of that. So that's how I did these two, these two steps towards first non-fiction and second the first person. And that's, now I've been writing 5 books like that, and well, it may change. It's not an ideology, nothing of that kind, but right now I can't imagine another way of writing. But it's very personal. There is nothing, you know, je ne revendique rien de, I don't say you have to write things like that. That's how I feel. Comfortable is not the right word, because sometimes these books are quite uncomfortable to write. But I feel that's how I feel the more honest with myself and with the reader, and also with the real characters that are depicted in the books.
So you say that the man at the center of L'Adversaire is like a black box, but that's not quite the same with Limonov, who himself has written about his life. And so that process must have been a little different. Can you tell us about how you wanted to write the book Limonov?
In fact, the processes are different with each book, because I mean, you know, it's like if I were, I sometimes like to think that I'm a portraitist. You know, if I were a painter, I think I will be a portraitist. As a gallery or museum watcher, I go my priority to look at portraits. It doesn't mean that I don't like landscape paintings or still lives or abstract painting, but portraits is what really fascinates me, and I think in a way that's what I'm trying to do. And the relationship between the painter, meaning me, and the model can be very, very different. You know, it can cover a very wide range of human relationships that come from, you know, from a very great defiance, even hostility, like I honestly had to with this murderer, Jean-Claude Roman. But also, he is a human being. He didn't he was sent, he was judged, he was sentenced. Who am I to sentence him once more? So it was very complicated. I didn't want to be his advocate. I didn't want to pas l'enfoncer davantage. I had a responsibility towards him. And then, well, I wrote another book, which My Life as a Russian Novel, which is a more private book. I think that it's about, well, real people who are of my around me, of my family, of my girlfriend at that time. I have written another one, which is called Other Lives Than Mine, which is also about, well, private people. I mean, in a way, Limonov did this, not the last one, but there. It was, in a way, the easiest thing to do, because Limonov is even if he's not a very well-known figure, he's a public figure. He himself wrote a lot of things about other people that are quite horrible. That's at the limit of the diffamation, the defamation. So, well, I didn't consider that I owed him such tellement d'égards, so many, to be so kind. Well, if he liked the book, fine, and in fact he liked it, and I'm happy if he did. But if he didn't, I don't really care about that. You know, I think he is a big boy enough, and I don't. It always depends on the. It's a different contract in a way, a moral contract with the in every each of these books with their main characters. And I think I explored a very wide range of these relationships.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Limonov as a man?
About Limonov as a... it's a bit... well, I should say maybe that I met Limonov in the early 80s in Paris. I was a young man, I was a journalist and a would-be writer at that time. And Limonov was... he was some kind of Russian dissident, but he was not really dissident. He was some kind more a Soviet punk or a punk dissident or a rock and roll dissident, something like that. He had quite a colorful and adventurous career. He had been well, he came from very proletarian background in Ukraine. In his youth he was some kind of petty thug, and then he became a poet in Moscow in the years of the Brezhnev underground. It's something that thing existed, and then he immigrated and to the United States. He lived also there. He tried to succeed as a writer and his wife as a model, but well, they didn't. He became almost a bum in the streets of New York, and then the butler of some kind of billionaire, and then he wrote books. He wrote autobiographical books about his very large experience of life, and well, I knew him in France when they were published, and I really liked his books, and I was not alone in that case. I think they were very, very good books, and you may, which may remind you of some kind of Russian Jack London, that kind, I mean, at least that kind of writer, that kind of man who is very direct, who had a very great experience of life, a lot of jobs, a lot of, well, not an intellectual, and someone who had a lot to tell. And I liked Limonov's books. I even liked him. I met him, and I sometimes interviewed him. We had common friends. And, well, everything would have been simple, if not after by the end of the 80s, when the Berlin Wall fell and the communism and the Soviet Union collapsed. When I say we, I mean his readers, his Parisian friends, who, well, we liked his provocative ways, things like that. We discovered that first he took part in the Balkan Wars of the early 90s. Siding with the Serbs and even shooting on Sarajevo under the very benevolent eyes of Radovan Karadzic. Then we discovered that he went back to his country, to now Russia, and created a political party with the very appealing name of National Bolshevik Party, which looked like a bunch of young skinheads who were, you know, in the streets of Moscow, well, hurlant, shouting, Gulag, Beria, Stalin, give them back. Well, so I thought, as all these other friends, Parisian friends thought, that, well, our very nice friend became a complete fascist and a horrible character. And later, I spent some time. At that time, I spent quite a lot of time in Russia. I did a documentary film in a small town in Russia, and I did once, I wrote a story, a piece for a magazine after the death of Anna Politkovskaya. And I spent this heroic journalist who was shot in, I think, 2007 or 8. And, well, I've spent some time in the circles with whom, you know, the quite small circles of, you know, Democrat activists in Russia who were surrounding Politkovskaya, or people like Elena Bonner, who was Andrei Sakharov's widow. And I discovered with astonishment that among these people, Limonov had a very good reputation. Limonov and his bunch of young fascists were considered as heroes of democracy, and the most courageous and people and the hope for the only hope that you can have for their country. It was extremely surprising, and that's for that reason that I decided to write a long piece for another magazine about Limonov. So I got his phone number. And I called him about 20 years after the last, or 15 years after the last time I met him, and asked him, well, I would like to come spend 2 weeks with you and make a portrait, a profile. And I did. And after 2 weeks with him, I knew even less what I thought about him than before. If I consider him a horrible figure or some kind of quite respectable man, I was in a complete mess. And I wrote the piece, which was pretty long, that I thought it maybe was worth something even longer, and a book. And I suddenly had the idea that there was the possibility, very challenging and demanding also, of doing two things that I haven't done, which was first an adventure novel, since you can deny a lot of things to him. You can't deny that he had a very adventurous life, which is worth of a novel by Alexandre Dumas or a roman picaresque, as you say. And also a book of history. I don't mean a historical novel, but really a book of history, although I am not an historian, about what happened in Russia and in Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism. Excuse me, it was quite a long answer, but it's quite a long life. And there are a lot of events in it.
And I actually do want to continue talking about Russia, because Russia looms very large over other writings of yours, especially My Life as a Russian Novel. And of course the work of your mother, Emmanuel Carrère, who is in the Académie Française and a major scholar on Russia. You talk about your connection to Russia, your time spent there, as you mentioned, Russian culture, the language, your attempts to learn the language. And that was, I think, in 2002 or 3.
2 and 3, yeah. So this book, My Life as a Russian Novel, it's an account of some kind of personal memoir about my life during 2 years, during which I did, among other things, which are also in the book, I did this documentary film I was referring to in a very small and backwater town in Russia, where happened very strange events and very tragic and sad events also, including the assassination, the killing of a young woman who used to work with us, with our small crew in this small town. She was killed by a madman with her young child, her baby, and it was a terrible story. And in fact, it also became the center of this film, which was supposed to be originally something very different, which was supposed to be a more classical documentary about life in such a small town.
And since that time, has this connection to Russia continued? How has that time and these interests affected your understanding now of all things Russian and specifically post-Soviet Russia? Are you still connected in that way to that land?
Yes, I am. I think maybe less than during the time I was working on this book, where I spent, I went at least, there was about 10 years where I went at least twice or 3 times a year to Russia, and maybe now I go once a year. No, I'm really, I have a personal link with Russia, which is, as you say, that my mother is both of Russian origin and also a great scholar and specialist of Russia. And when I came first not really first, but first as an adult to Russia, which was quite late in my life, I was in my early 40s, I felt first, in fact, I love this country, despite the fact that it's quite difficult to live there. It's a very brutal country, but it's that is something that I really like, and also I felt that, in a way, I belonged a little to this, and there was something that was very, very important to me, which was to try to. I used to speak a little Russian when I was a child, it's the mother tongue of my mother, if not mine. And I forgot almost everything. And then I tried to reconquer some of my Russian, which was not a complete success. In fact, I speak quite bad Russian. That it was it had some kind of strangely of therapeutic or cathartic quality to learn Russian, and even during these years, the subject of this book, I even wrote in Russian. I mean, wrote some kind of diary during 2 years in Russian, which was in very, very bad Russian, but in Russian. And I discovered, and part of these diaries are in the book. I translated them to make the book My Life as a Russian Novel. It's composed partly of these diaries. And I discovered that, strangely enough, I was able to write in Russian things that I should maybe not have written in French. It's a quite strange phenomenon, which not that rare, in fact, with people who had that kind of connection with a foreign language, which is both theirs and not theirs, which is, this quality that is, it is also what Freud referred as the Unheimliche, which is both the familiar and the unfamiliar. And Russian has this the Russian language has this quality for me. And I think this book, in a way, My Life as a Russian Novel, has this kind of quality also.
And it is a book. You eventually do write things in French that you were revealing, at least initially, in Russian. It's a very intimate book. You talk about where you live. You talk about your sex life in graphic detail. Your mother and her life, and the skeletons in the closet of your family, namely your grandfather. And you're very self-critical, pointing out many of your very intimate flaws. What compels you, what pushes you to write so openly like that for a national, international readership about such a matter?
No, that's the only book I wrote like that, which is, in fact, effectively very, very, it's first the only really autobiographical book I wrote, because all the books I wrote, they are in the first person. I am very present in them. I am the narrator. I am the witness. I am the voice who tells the story. But it's not about me. I am a counterpoint. I tell about my doubts, my hesitations, things like that. But I'm not in this book. I am well, I'm not only the narrator, but I am also the protagonist. Me and my family and my girlfriend at that time. And yeah, it's a very private book, maybe too private, certainly too private. I can't say I regret having written it, but it was very, very problematic. And I wish I would not write another book like that. It was very, it had this therapeutic quality in a way. It was like, you know, some kind of savage psychoanalysis, which was, well, not so, au dépens also, which was on the, not only, you know, when you say that I point my flaws and things like that, that's not a problem. It's very easy to point one's flaws, and so you say what you want about yourself. That's when you begin to tell things about other people that they maybe will not like you to tell, that it becomes very problematic, you know, saying what you can, well, there is no courage at all to tell to tell about your defaults or things like that. But about other people, which basically were my mother, who didn't agree, because the book is also about the figure of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who had a very complicated story, who to say things very short, to make the story very short, he was, in fact, he was a Georgian immigrant, and he worked for the Germans during World War II, and he disappeared after the liberation, and he certainly was killed, and for facts of collaboration. Well, and my mother, well, she was very young at that time, and that was something that was very tragic for her. It's not only a death, it's also a disappearance. So my father vanished when she was 15, and there was some shame around about that. So, well, see, she really didn't want me to write about that. I felt the need to write about that, but it was very, very conflictual, and I also, excuse me, I also wrote very private things about my girlfriend at that time, including some kind of pornographic short story I have written for the journal Le Monde, and well, all this made a book that is that makes me honestly pretty. I think it. Honestly, I think it's quite a good book. At least, I know. I mean, an interesting book, or it has something. I don't, but I feel quite uncomfortable about it, honestly, and I wish I would not do anymore something like that.
Other people may feel that way about a book that they've written, but you actually include your email address in the book and in the whole story. I should add that too.
You put in your email address, that's not compromising at all. It's not like they're giving your phone number. You know, you said anyone can send you an email. You can delete it if you don't like it. It will never disturb you. No, it's very protected. You are very protected by an email address. There is nothing very courageous doing that. It's.
But are you still receiving responses?
Yes, I do. I do still. Yeah. There are still readers of this book who first they always say, is the address, is it a joke? Is the address still valid? And generally the answer, yes, it's still valid. And who tell me, well, it depends.
So your latest work, Le Royaume, which I haven't read yet, is also a bit of a personal book, as I understand it, and it's also a bit of the history of Christianity. There's no shortage of books about the history of Christianity, and yet you were compelled to write.
No.
What do you think that you contribute to that discussion as a non-scholar, a non-academic, that made you want to write the book now?
Well, that's... first, in a way, you know, it's easier to write about something about which were written, I think, 2 million books, more than if there were only 2 or 3 very good books about it. You know, it's well, if there are 1 million books, why not 1,000,001? You can, and I think that maybe if it sounds pretentious, that I could tell this story in a way that it hadn't been told exactly. In fact, when you say it's a book about the story, the beginning of Christianity, it's true that it's not a life of Jesus. There were so many lives of Jesus, And this I would not have dared to do that, to do one more. That it's a book about, well, in fact, it's some kind of imaginary biography of one of the author of one of the Gospels, with the Gospel according to Luke. So I try to imagine who was this Luke, about whom one knows very, very little, because there is, well, there is a mention of him in 2 letters of Paul, and well, almost nobody knows who he was, and it was for me very so. Well, as far as I know, there are a lot of books about these Gospels according to Luke, about the Acts of the Apostles, which are books of, you know, biblical critique, of exegesis, of history. But that kind of book, which is some kind of both historical and novelistic recreation of that. No, not that much. You know, in a way, I don't compare it that can be compared to that kind of book like the Memoirs of Adrien of Marguerite Yourcenar. Well, there have been books about the Roman emperors and about Adrien, but it's well. It was not pretentious on the side of Marguerite Yourcenar, not being a scholar, to think that she could write something original and interesting about a Roman emperor, and that's what I did about the author of a Gospel. That's what I tried to do. I agree that it's quite bad and it's quite challenging, but and I mixed it all. Well, it's some kind of well, it's some kind of guided tour in the New Testament, in a way. In the Gospels, in the letters of Paul, in the things like that, and it takes place in a quite short, stretch of time, which is about well, 40 or 50 years. You know, compared to what we call the Old Testament, which stretches on more than 10 centuries. It's well, the New Testament was written in a very short time. Most of its authors were people who belonged to the same generation, or who knew each other. And I try also to say these people who are known as Saint Paul, Saint John, Saint Luke, Saint Peter, before being saints with, comme on dit, des auréoles, well, they were real people, they were human beings, and I tried to portray them in a realistic way. You don't know what was really realistic, but if you consider, for instance, the painting, the classical, the religious paintings, well, you have representations of these people which are very idealized, which are represented with, I would say, Giotto or Angelico, and others that try to be realistic. I mean, Caravaggio or painters like that. And I sided with this kind of painters. And the book is also some kind of personal account, a personal memoir about a moment in my life where I had been a very devout Christian for a few years, out of, I think, some quite personal chaotic circumstances, but it was 20 years ago, some more, but I thought it was interesting to, this text of the New Testament, which I was scrutinizing, not I really as an historian, but as some kind of investigator. I believed, there was a moment in my life where I believed literally in what they said, and in the idea that they were the word of God, and so creating some kind of dialogue between the kind of reader and the kind of the person I was 20 years ago, and my attitude towards this text, and the non-believer that I am now, and I thought it was interesting, and it's and so it makes. Maybe it sounds pretentious to say that, but it's some kind of meditation about what is among, if we are. I speak for me, but also for us, a lot of my readers, but not all of them. Also, if we are not believers, what is left of Christianity and of the heart of Christianity. in our mind or even in our souls if we believe in such a thing. So, well, that's a book about that.
One of the things that I always am interested in discussing with writers is their process. It's just a day in the life. I mean, do you write on a computer? Do you write in the morning? Do you have set hours? What is your ritual for writing?
I have no rituals. I write on a computer. I sometimes, scribble notes on a paper, but no, I write on a computer. And well, I would like to write regularly, but for me, no, I admire. There are some writers among them, the greatest ones, who had a very, a rule which is to spend, let's say, 2 or 3 hours a day in front of their desk, in front of and even not to write, but to be there in case somebody said that. No, Flannery O'Connor, for instance, whom I love, and she said, well, I have to be there. I mean, write nothing, but if there is something that has to be written, I shall be there. And I understand that completely, but I try to do that, and I am not able to do that. I can. It depends. I'm the kind of person who can write quite a lot when a book is well. It's de croisière. It's space. When it's moving on. So I can write a lot, but in the beginning, it's more tedious and difficult process, and where regularity, which I would like to be able of, but it's quite a challenge and a defeat.
My final question. You mentioned Flannery O'Connor. Who are some of the other Anglo-Saxon writers that you read?
Oh, a lot. Well, I mentioned Truman Capote, who was really a seminal influence. I mean, I like most of the books by Capote, but really in Cold Blood was an influence. I also...
Philip Dick?
Huh? Yes, no, I was thinking to mention Philip K. Dick, about whom I wrote a book, and not only Philip K. Dick, but in fact I used to be and still I am a great reader of science fictions, horror stories, things like that. In fact I'm a really living encyclopedia about that. It's very difficult for you to mention, a short horror story, which are in anthologies, things like that I haven't read. And there are a lot of that kind of stuff. I could mention also one of my favorite books is Edith Wharton's Ethan Frome, which I think is the saddest novel that was ever written. I think compared to it, Wuthering Heights, it's like Mary Poppins. And I reread it every 2 years, and I'm astonished by this book everywhere. But I should add a lot of names, because I'm a very eclectic reader, in fact. I love a lot of things. I like reading in English. If it's not too difficult, for instance, Faulkner, it's too difficult for me, for instance. Even Dickens, I love Dickens, but I'm not able to read Dickens in English. But right, for instance, from I was mentioning, or in Cold Blood, things like that. Well, no, I can read it in English, and I enjoy reading in English. In fact, with a little in Russian, that's the only foreign language in which I'm able to read a book. There is, I think, something that is consistency in his life, which is some kind of in a way, a very childish, but in a way, a respectable desire to be a hero. It takes very wrong ways to try to be a hero, but that's his idea, and that's what is also strange. He is a writer. He's quite a talented writer, and he's proud of himself as a writer. But it's not that very important for him. What imports for him is not to be a writer; it's to be the hero of a novel. That's why, even if he disagrees with most of my statements about him and his position, things like that. That's why he is happy with the book, because there is a novel about him, and he's smart enough to know that it's far better for him if it's written not by one of his young devotees where nobody will read it. And that if someone who is, as he says, on the other side of the barricade, who is his exact opposite, and who is as he says, joking, but I think half joking, if I were in power, I would send you to the gulag. You are the kind of guy I would send to the gulag. You are exactly the kind of bourgeois intellectual that he despises. I was quite lucky in English language, which, as I said, is the only one where I can have an opinion about the translation. And especially for the last one, Limonov, I really I think that John Lambert made a terrific job, and I had the opportunity for the first time to have a real collaboration with the translator, with him. He sent me what he did, 50 pages by 50 pages, and we discussed it. There were things that he wasn't sure, he asked me. There were things that I wasn't sure I told him, and it was very... we trust each other very well, we got along very well, and it was really a very pleasant, I really hope he will be the translator of my next book into English. The problem is that he's himself writing a novel, so I'm afraid, which I approve, and he's a very talented guy, but I'm afraid he will not be available for translating, which is quite a huge book, in fact.
Will you translate his book into French?
Oh, why not? Why not? I never did the translation. I never. I never did. But there is some kind of project about which I can't tell, not out of secrecy, but because it's only the beginning of it, and there might be something like a film or a TV program or something like that about that, and I am not against it. I think it's possible to do that. In fact, in the beginning of when I began to work on this, in fact, I have been the Canal Plus that proposed me to write a TV program. Une série télé, on dit comment? TV series. A TV series. Well, about gangster, and I know nothing about gangster. I don't understand them. It's not my. Well, I told them I was not able to do that, and they told me, but if you have an idea, why not to? And at that time, I was watching a TV series called Deadwood, which is a western, which I liked very, very, very much. And I was asking myself, what could be possible in that? And suddenly, because, well, I had read a lot about that, I was interested in that doing a TV series about, one of the small first Christian communities around St. Paul, let's say in Corinth, in the years 50 of the first century of our era, well, it could be very interesting. So I began to read the New Testament, thinking of that, and I wanted to, and thinking of writing that what in the vocabulary of the TV people is called the Bible. A Bible, it's this small document telling what the series will be about, what are the main characters, things like that. But after a few weeks trying to thinking of writing this Bible, I discovered that I was too much interested in the thing I wanted to do it really myself, and to be the seul maître à bord, and not to have 50 people around me telling me you have to write it like this or not like that. But there was an idea of that kind, yes. A very important and a very difficult thing for me to find what is the subject of a book, and sometimes there is the idea that there is something that is really a subject, and which can mobilize with my energies, and I'm not, there are some writers who are able to write about anything, you know, and I admire them, but I don't belong to them. I really need to have, you know, like a dog who needs to have a bone to bite, and finding a subject is a very you have to have this feeling that's of absolute evidence of, you know, that's it's that you are the only person who can do that, that it's for you and for no one else. Even if you can't believe that during the whole process, but I think if you don't believe that at least one moment at the beginning, nothing can be done. What you say makes I quite worry about that, because, you know, I've finished this book and I have no other project right now, and I don't know what I shall be doing, and right now it seems to me impossible that I found a new subject. It already was like that in other times, but there is the feeling of void, something like that. That is. It's not unbearable. Don't not exaggerate, but it's a bit upsetting.